Good evening. I welcome you all to the 54th meeting of the study circle. The meeting is going to be on the topic introspection of constitutional doctrines, and I welcome the speaker, Mr. Sivashanmugam, to begin with it.
Good evening, friends, and I welcome you all. This should be the second edition of the introspection of constitutional doctrines. On the earlier occasion, we have dealt with doctrines touching upon Article 13. Here, this is now in this speech, the introspection is going to be on 8 doctrines, and last 2 is reserved for Schedule 7. So straight away, I can jump into the doctrines. Now, to start with the doctrine of legitimate expectation, the word legitimate expectation is not defined in any law for the time being in force, and this is a doctrine fashioned by the court to review the administrative actions. The concept of legitimate expectation is an administrative law and has now gained sufficient importance and now considered as one of the rights, though on equity grounds under the writs and other constitutional fields. The concepts are fashioned by the court for review of administrative action, and this creation takes place besides such principles as principles of natural justice, unreasonableness, the judiciary duty of local authorities, and principles of proportionality. It was to restrict the right to be heard that legitimate expectation was introduced into law. Now, what is meant by legitimate expectation? It is not a legal right. It is an expectation of a benefit, a relief, or a remedy that may ordinarily flow from a promise or an established practice. The term established practice refers to a regular, consistent, predictable, or certain conduct, process, or activity of a decision making authority. The expectation should be legitimate, that is, reasonable, logical, and valid. Any expectation based on a sporadic or a casual or random act, which is not unreasonable, illogical, or invalid, cannot be legitimate. This is not a right. It cannot be enforced as such. It is a concept fashioned by the courts for judicial review of administrative actions. It is a procedural based on the requirement of higher degree of fairness in administrative action and a consequence of a promise made or practice established. If you go by origin of the legitimate expectation, we have to fall back on Lord Denning. Lord Denning, in Schmidt versus Secretary of Home Affairs, he propounded this theory of legitimate expectation, and I just quote it as follows. The speech in Ridge versus Baldwin shows that an administrative body may in proper case be bound to give person who is affected by their decision an opportunity of making representations. It all depends on whether he has some right interest, or I would add some legitimate expectation of which it would not be fair or fair to deprive him without hearing what he has to say. So that seems to be the starting point of the principles of legitimate expectation. It evolved in India and categorized or formulated by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case reported in Sethi Auto Service Station versus Delhi Development Authority, which is reported in 2000 AR 2009, Supreme Court 904. The Honorable Supreme Court has categorized or given the broad outline of what it should be, or what all the ingredients should be there to attract the legitimate expectation. It reads as follows. When an administrative body, because of representation or by past practice, conduct, aroused an expectation which it would be within its power to fulfill, unless some overriding public interest may come in the way. However, person who bases his claim on the doctrine of legitimate expectation at the first instance has to satisfy that he relied on the said representation and denial of the expected has worked to his detriment. Or in other words, he has to show that he had the activities of the administrative body was such he has made to move or he has agreed or contracted to work. So this should be the basis of the doctrine of legitimate expectation. Then the second concept would be the doctrine of waiver. The doctrine of waiver based on a premise that a person who in his best judgment has given up a liberty or waive his liberty or waive his enjoyment of such rights as are conferred to him by the state. Black's Law Dictionary defines waiver as the voluntary relinquishment or abandonment, either expressed or implied, of a legal right or advantage. It also says that a party alleged to have waived a right must have both knowledge of the existing right and intention of foregoing it. So, this uh, doctrine of waiver has its genesis from US jurisprudence. In US court, a famous case now, even now, it is called as Miranda rights, that arose out of a famous case of Miranda versus State of Arizona, where the Supreme Court laid the requirements and which includes stipulations that the person who is getting arrested has a right to remain silent and that they may have an attorney at present questioning. So these are all the two rights that came to be conferred by the court, and it is up to the accused either to accept it and remain silent to or to make confession before the prosecutor or the police authorities. And this right is called as thereafter it being called as Miranda rights. And the prosecution in the American jurisprudence, once the accused has confessed of the crime, the job of the prosecution made easy. They have to only demonstrate before the court that the waiver was voluntary and the accused made on his own without any intimidation, coercion, force, or deception. So this is called as popularly now, even now, it is being called as Miranda rights. This doctrine of waiver stepped into India, and later it's made as a doctrine. Now it is in 1992 Supplement 1 SCC page number 5. In the case of Jaswant Singh, Mathura Singh and another versus Ahmedabad Municipality Corporation and others, the Supreme Court has observed as follows. The court said everyone has a right to waive an advantage or a protection which seeks to give him or her a right or an opportunity which was available under the law if the person foregoes on his own, either with this intention and with the knowledge to forego such right, it is called as waiver, and that is accepted by the courts in India. Now, next question comes is whether a person can waive his fundamental rights, or in other words, a fundamental rights of a person could be waived. The Honorable Supreme Court, as well as early as 1959, in the case of AR 1959 Supreme Court 149, Beshar Nath versus Income Tax Commissioner, has stated that the rights conferred under the Part 3 is conferred under the preamble in which the Constitution reads as follows, in which the Constitution says that we the people of India conferring the right on us through this document. I just read the preamble. We the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic and to secure all its citizens a justice, social, economical, and political. So, having gone after reiterating the preamble of the Constitution of India, the Supreme Court said The rights that are conferred under the Part 3 cannot be waived by a person, whether even if he has an intention or no such intention to waive so. So that came to be held as early as 1959, and subsequently in Yusuf Ali Abdullah versus M.S. Kasbekar, reported in AR 1982, Bombay 135. The Bombay High Court has distinguished the rights, that Miranda rights as well as the rights that are conferred under the Constitution of India, and has held that these rights cannot be waived by fundamental rights cannot be waived by a citizen willingly or unwillingly. Then the third right should be the third doctrine should be doctrine of parent patria. This is a Latin term which means that the parent of his or her country. So in this doctrine, the state is regarded as a sovereign. The state, in its capacity as a provider of protection of those unable to care for themselves, or in other words, the state is considered to be the parent of all the destitutes or those persons who cannot take care of themselves. The doctrine by which the government has a standing to prosecute a lawsuit on behalf of citizens, especially on behalf of someone who is under legal disability, to prosecute the suit. The state ordinarily has no standing to sue on behalf of its citizens unless a separate or sovereign interest will be served by the suit. Uh, this is also, we have borrowed extensively from the United States. In fact, in the United States, United States Supreme Court articulated the test of parent patria and has given three ingredients to the sovereign. It must articulate an interest apart from the interest of a particular parties. The state must be more than a normal party, and the state must express a quasi-sovereign interest, and it must allege the injury to be sufficiently substantial segment of its population. Or in other words, this concept came to India and followed in the state of Kerala versus N.V. Thomas, reported in 1976 1 SCR 906. Justice Matthew has observed that the court is also a state within the meaning of Article 12 of the Constitution of India. The court should also act as parens patria for the welfare of the people, to protect, control the persons under disability like the state function. The constitutional bench of the Honorable Supreme Court in the case reported in Chamanlal Shahu versus Union of India, 1991 SCC page number 613, explained the term parens patria. Referring to the words and phrases, the court has observed that it is the interest and the power of the authority of a legislature to protect the persons and the property of the persons non sui juris, such as minors, insane, and incompetent persons. The court further observed sovereign has a power of guardianship over the persons under such disability. It is duty bound for the public interest to protect those persons with under disabilities and who have no rightful resources. Then another question that may lingering in the mind is, or the hot subject would be the right of euthanasia and parent patria. This is going to be a controversial topic, and this has been in controversy for some time now. In Vikram Dio Tomar versus State of Bihar, reported in 1998 Supplement ACC 734, the Honorable Supreme Court has observed that we live in an age where this court has demonstrated, while interpreting Article 21 of the Constitution, that every person is entitled to quality of life, which is inconsistent with this human personality, which is inconsistent. However, the right to life, live with human dignity, is a fundamental right, and every citizen has a right of life. Does not have the right include the right to die. This was held by the Honorable Supreme Court in Gyan Kaur versus State of Punjab. This is reported in 1996 to SEC 648. In India, the right of mercy killing or euthanasia is a growing subject, and it is growing now. And it is always subject to the research and study. Euthanasia, which may be active or passive, is not lawful in India. The Supreme Court of India, in the case referred to in Airedale case, that is Airedale NHGS Trust versus Bland, reported in 1993, All England Law Reporter, page number 82, has observed that euthanasia could be made as a law by legislature. There is no specific legislation in India which has legalized euthanasia, unlike the countries like Netherlands, Switzerland, Holland, Belgium, etc., where euthanasia has been made into a law and it's no more an illegal act. In UK, the illegality was removed to remove the person who has been in the state of permanent vegetative state, and withdrawal of life support is no more an illegality. All these things devolved, and in India, in the case of referring to Vikasa's Vishaka case, that is reported in JT 1997 Supreme Court, page number 384, or equivalent is AR 1997 Supreme Court 3011. Supreme Court has laid down certain principles relating to passive euthanasia. These conditions will remain in force till legislature or a parliament comes out with a law on touching on this subject. The conditions are only twofold. The decision has to be taken to discontinue life support either by the parents or the spouse, or in other case a close relative or body of persons acting as a next friend. It can be taken by a doctors attending to the patient. However, such decision has to be bona fide in the best interest of the patient. That should be the first condition. And second condition is, even if a decision is taken by a near relative or doctor or a next friend to withdraw the life support, such decision requires approval from the High Court as laid down in RD's case. Hence, the doctrine of parens pateria has been applied when the patient has no family members or a near relatives, and a treating doctors can decide for the withdrawal of the life support with the approval of High Court. And the High Court here in the state, within the meaning of Article 12 of the Constitution, shall take a call on this subject. This was so happened in a Bombay case where a nurse was raped in a prisons of hospital, and she was in the permanent vegetative state for almost 15 to 16 years. And thereafter, the hospital took a decision to go for passive euthanasia and to withdraw the life support system. After getting the approval from the Bombay High Court, her life support system was withdrawn. The Honorable Supreme Court in Aruna Ramachandra Shanbag case, this is reported in 2011, 4 SEC 454, has observed that Article 226 of Constitution of India gives ample power to the High Courts to decide on the suitable orders on the application made by the next friend, parent, or near relatives or hospital staff seeking permission to withdraw the life support system on a patient who is in the permanent vegetative state. And this concept of parens pateria is also used in industrial catastrophe and for seeking relief or remedies to the citizens. In the famous case of Union Carbide versus Union of India, which is reported in AR 1992 Supreme Court 248, the Honorable Supreme Court has permitted the Union of India to file a suit seeking compensation against the union management of Union Carbide and to proceed with a suit before the US court. These are all the famous incidents wherein the doctrine of parens pateria is used. The fourth doctrine should be the doctrine of promissory estoppel. In a way, it has got a genesis from Section 115 of the Indian Evidence Act, which deals with estoppel. I just read the few principles of Section 115 of the Indian Evidence Act, where one person, by his declaration, act, or omission, intentionally caused or permitted another person to believe such a thing to be true and to act upon such belief, neither he nor his representative shall be allowed in any suit or proceeding between himself and such person or his representative to deny the truth of that thing. The jurisprudence behind this doctrine would be like this doctrine is also an promissory estoppel doctrine is an equitable doctrine. Like all equitable remedies, it is purely discretionary. In contrast to the common law, absolute right is not. There is no such right called as absolute right, and every right is always given by the reasonable restrictions. This doctrine of promissory estoppel is variously called as promissory estoppel, equitable estoppel, or quasi estoppel, or something called as a now new estoppel. It is a principle evolved in equity, and the principle of promissory estoppel can be given in a nutshell as follows. Almost it is being borrowed from Section 115 of Evidence Act. Here also the ingredients would be like this, where one party has by his words or conduct made other party a clear and unequivocal promise which is intended to create a legal relations or effect a legal relationship arise that may arise in future, knowing or with an intention that it would be acted upon by the other party to whom such promise is made, and such promise would be binding on the party who is making it, and he would not be entitled to go back upon it. So, in India, this concept came very early. It can be divided into two stages. One is application of this doctrine prior to Anglo-Afghan case and after post Anglo-Afghan case. In Union of India versus Anglo-Afghan agencies reported in AR 1968, Supreme Court 718, the doctrine of promissory estoppel is made applicable as against the government also. Either to there was a small dispute whether the promissory estoppel could be acted against the government or not. But after the Union of India versus Anglo-Afghan case, it has been made applicable to the government also as against the government also. Then the limits of application of the principles of promissory estoppel. The doctrine of promissory estoppel cannot be invoked for preventing the government from acting in discharge of its duty as laid under the law. The doctrine cannot be applied to subvert an obligation or a liability imposed under law. The third condition would be it cannot be used to compel the government or even a private party to do any act which is prohibited under the law. And there cannot be any promissory estoppel against the exercise of legislative power. And finally, the legislature can never be precluded from exercising its legislative function by resorting to doctrine of promissory estoppel. Now, expanding the scope of promissory estoppel has led to a few other peculiar situations, and it has arisen into few other disputes that requires clarification by the Honorable Supreme Court. There are three types of disputes. One is, should the promissory estoppel be allowed to be used as a cause of action? That has to be decided by the Honorable Supreme Court or any court. The second should be, could the doctrine be used against the government, and if so, and when and under what circumstances? And third, should the promisee suffer detriment before he can invoke the doctrine? These are all the three aspects that remains to be cleared by the Honorable Supreme Court. In fact, the Law Commission in its 108th report has recommended to the state, has recommended the government to insert this promissory estoppel in as Section 25B of Indian Contracts Act, and this is yet to be inserted, or an act has to be passed by the Parliament by inserting this promissory estoppel or acting on the recommendations of the 108th Law Commission. The fifth doctrine should be the doctrine of public trust. The doctrine of public trust is propounded by the Roman Empire, and it is as old as 1500 years. Romanian King Justinian has stated that the air, water, and the sea are all common to the public and is entitled to be used by everyone and anyone, and as it is the law of the nature. Thereafter, the principles of public trust has been borrowed, and it's imbibed in Magna Carta. Thus, in England, the ownership can be largely divided into two types. One is jus privatum and other is jus publicum. The jus publicum is the lands that are held by the king as a trustee for the public benefit. And this concept of public trust was accepted and passed by the courts of United States in the year 1921 in the famous case of Arnold versus Mundy, and subsequently in Illinois Central Railroad versus State of Illinois, where the court has held that the state cannot hand over its trust of its resources to a private ownership when the interest of public is involved. The public trust doctrine serves two purposes. It mandates affirmative state action for effective management of its resources. Two, it empowers the citizens to question the ineffective management of natural resources. It's a common law concept defined and addressed by the academics in the United States and subsequently in the United Kingdom. And this was percolated into Indian judiciary, and it was first followed and observed in India in the famous case of MC Mehta versus Kamal Nath. This is reported in 1997, 1 SEC, page number 388. On the side of the subject, this concept of public trust is largely used in the protection of environments and environmental principles and the forest that is being followed and which it is being accepted. In fact, in the case of Majra Singh versus Indian Oil Corporation reported in 1999, Jammu and Kashmir, page number 81, the Jammu and Kashmir High Court has held that the location of a bottling plant or filling up of gas cylinders cannot be done in the forest or elsewhere where the large public would be affected. Therefore, the concept of public trust has been imbibed into the fundamental rights as Article 21, and as on date, the position of law is very clear that any rights or where the public would be affected, the state cannot give its resources like forest, water, sea, or any other thing to a private body to the detriment of the public, and it has to be protected by the state because it is the it is held by the state under the capacity of public trust. Recently, in this, the Honorable Supreme Court has directed the states of UP to maintain the river Ganges in its purest form, and they invoke the concept of public trust for passing such an order. And the third case that should be covering this subject is MI Builders versus Radhesham Shahu. This is reported in AR 99 Supreme Court 2468, where the Supreme Court has applied the public trust document and restrained the MI builders from putting up the construction to the detriment of the public and for to stop the deforestation. The sixth doctrine should be the doctrine of sustainable development. Again, largely this concept of sustainable development is used in the field of um, protection of environment, or in largely used in the environmental cases. At least in the state of Tamil Nadu, it is being used to counter the allegations of encroachments or to encroachments into the natural resources like forest, or uh, the to stop the large scale destruction of natural other natural resources. This concept of sustainable development came into existence in the year 1972, and in the Stockholm Declaration. The crux of the sustainable development is, it reads as follows: the objectives of sustainable development are to maintain the production of goods and services for development and efficiency, and also includes the conservation, management of natural resources, including preservation of biodiversity and maintenance of biological integrity. Third should be maintenance and enhancement of quality of life, adapting the principles of equitable distribution of wealth and material resources. These objectives are respectively called as economic, environmental, and social objectives. And these are all the key principles for the sustainable development. From the environmental point of view, the object of principles of sustainable development centers around three issues: to maintain essential ecological processes, to preserve the genetic diversity, to secure sustainable utilization of species and ecosystems. This doctrine has got 8 subspecies or 8 other salient features. They are intergenerational equity, use and conservation of natural resources, environmental protection, the precautionary principles, the principles of polluter pays, the principles of liability to help and cooperate, then poverty eradication, and principles of public trust. Already we have covered the principles of public trust. I will be just harping on two things. Intergenerational equity. This is largely a relatively unknown concept to Indian judiciary for a long time. This principles of intergenerational equity presupposes that the right of each generation of human beings to the benefit from cultural and natural resources of the past generation, as well as it has an obligation to preserve such heritage for the future generations. The principle emphasizes that conservation of biodiversity resources and renewable resources like forest, water, soil, etc., to preserve it and to pass it on to the next generation as what we have received from our forefathers. This principles of intergenerational equity again has its genesis in the Stockholm Declaration in the year 1972. And the principles, uh, there are two principles involved in it. I will just read those two principles. Principle one: man has a fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of quality that permits a life of dignity and well being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for the present and future generations. The second principle should be such natural resources of the earth, including air, water, lands, flora, fauna, and especially the representative samples of natural ecosystems, must be safeguarded for the benefit of the present and future generations through careful planning management as appropriate. This policy of doctrine of sustainable development was accepted and implemented by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of AP Pollution Control Board versus MV Naidu, and it is reported in 1999 to SEC, page number 718, where the Apex Court has held that state government attempt to balance the need for environmental and need of economic development, it would not be proper to prohibit it from doing so. In such a case, it would safer to apply the protective principles and principles of polluter pays, keeping in mind the principles of sustainable development and principles of intergenerational equity. Before going to the last two doctrines, that should be the doctrine of pith and substance and doctrine of colorable legislation, it would be better, I think, uh, if we go, take to Article 246 of the Constitution of India, where 246 reads as follows: the subject matter of law made by the Parliament by legislature of the states. It reads, notwithstanding anything contained in clauses 2 and 3, Parliament has the exclusive power to make laws with respect to any of the matters enumerated in List 1 of 7th Schedule. This is called as Union List. Then Clause 2 is called as State List, and third is Concurrent List. Here, the doctrine of pith and substance comes into play. Its meaning of the basic purpose of this doctrine of pith and substance is to determine under which head of power or field or under which list, that is 3 schedules we have got, a given piece of legislation should fit in. The pith means true nature or essence of something, and substance means the most important or essential part of something. So, in other words, the doctrine of pith and substance would mean the true nature and the essence of something as legislature, or which is the most and important essential part of that legislature, has to be taken into consideration to fit in that legislature into any of the 3 lists: state list, union list, state list, and the concurrent list. This this principle or this doctrine is essentially a Canadian doctrine, and which is firmly entrenched now in India in the constitutional jurisprudence. This doctrine was followed even prior to independence by the PCs, and that is Privy Councils. And in the case of Cushing versus Dupee, this principles was enunciated by the Privy Councils. And under what circumstances this application of doctrine of pith and substance can be entertained? The Honorable Supreme Court in Jijubai Nanabai Kachar versus State of Gujarat, reported in 1995, Supplement 1 SEC, page number 596, has held. I'll just read the relevant portion only so that we'll have an entire idea. It is well settled law of interpretations that entries in the 7th schedule are not powers but field of legislations. The legislature derives its power from Article 246 and not other related articles of the Constitution. Therefore, the power to make Amendment Act is derived. Amendment Act is derived not from the respective entries but under Article 246 of Constitution. The language of the respective entries should be given the widest scope of their meaning, fairly capable to meet the machinery of the government settled by the Constitution. Each general word should be extended to all ancillary or subsidiary matters which can be fairly and reasonably be comprehended in it. When the wires of the enactment are impugned, there is initial presumption of constitutionality, and if there is any difficulty in ascertaining the limits of legislative power, the difficulty must be resolved as far as possible in favor of legislature, putting the most liberal construction upon the legislative entry so that it may have the widest amplitude. Here, the concept is the key ingredient should be whether the encroachment upon the 3 list, whether it's a permanent one or it's an incidental or ancillary encroachment. In fact, as early as in 1947, the provisional, the PC, in the case reported in Prafulla Kumar Mukherjee versus Bank of Commerce, AR 1947 PC, page number 60, equivalent is 1947 to MLJ. page number 6. The Bombay High Court has succinctly explained in situation in which the state legislature dealing with any matter may incidentally affect any item in the union list. The court has held that whatever may be the ancillary or the incidental effects of a statute enacted by a state legislature, such matter must be attributed to the appropriate list according to the true nature and character. Thus, in other words, in fact, it is reiterated by the Honorable Supreme Court in the Bharat Hydropower Corporation versus State of Assam, reported in 2004, 2 SCC 553, wherein it has held that if the encroachment by a state legislature is only incidental, it will not affect the competence of the state legislature to enact a law in question. Also, if the substance of the enactment fails within the union list, then the incidental encroachment by the enactment of the state legislature would not make it invalid as held by the Supreme Court. That's how the Supreme Court has held it. There's another tricky position is if the situation relating to the fifth of substance is a bit different, if the matter falls within the concurrent list. If the law is covered by an entry in the state list made by the state legislature contain provisions which is directly and substantially relates to the matter enumerated in the concurrent list and is repugnant to the provisions of any existing law for that matter in the concurrent list, then the repugnant provision in the state list must be void unless it can coexist and operate without repugnancy to the provisions of the existing law under the concurrent list. This was so held by the Honorable Supreme Court in Bondu Ramasamy and others versus Bangalore Development Authority and others. In the case reported in 2010, 7 SCC, page number 129. Then again, I can refer to another judgment reported in 2010, 5 SCC, page number 246. Zahir Ahmad, Latifur Rahman Sheikh versus State of Maharashtra and others, wherein the Honorable Supreme Court has enunciated the principles of doctrine of pith and substance. And the last of the doctrine should be the doctrine of colorable legislations. This doctrine of colorable legislation is again built on the founding stones of the doctrine of separation of power. The separation of power mandates that a balance of power is to be struck between the different components of the state. The primary functions of legislature is to make law. Whenever legislature tries to shift this balance of power towards itself, then the doctrine of colorable legislation is attracted to take care of legislative accountability. The literal meaning of colorable legislation is that under the color or guise of the power conferred for one particular purposes, the legislature cannot seek to achieve some other purpose which is otherwise not competent to legislate on. The doctrine traces its origin to a Latin maxim. I can't read it there, but I will give you the meaning of the implications of the maxim. When anything is prohibited directly, it is also prohibited indirectly. In the common parlance, it is meant to be understood that whatever legislature cannot do directly, it cannot do indirectly. In our constitution, this doctrine is usually applied to Article 246, which has demarcated the legislative competences upon a particular subject, but indirectly makes one. By applying these principles, the fate of impugned legislation is decided. In the case reported in AR 1953 Supreme Court 375, KC Gajapati Narayana Dio and others versus State of Orissa, the Honorable Supreme Court puts the entire colorable legislations in a nutshell, and which reads as follows. Transgression may be patent, manifest, or direct, but it may also be disguised, covert, and it is to this later class of cases the expression of colorable legislation has been applied in judicial pronouncements. The idea conveyed by the expression is that although a legislature in passing a statute purported to act within the limits of its power, yet in substance and reality it transgressed those powers, such transgression being veiled by whatever appears on a proper examination to be a mere pretense or a disguise. This doctrine is also called as fraud on the Constitution. Failure to comply with the constitutional condition for the exercise of legislative power may be overt and or may be covert. When it is overt, we say the law is bad for non-compliance. The requirement of the Constitution, that is to say, the law is ultra vires. However, the non-compliance is covered. We say it's a fraud on Constitution. Therefore, the charge of fraud on the Constitution is on ultimate analysis is nothing but a picturesque or epigrammatic way of expressing the idea of non-compliance with the terms of Constitution. This was so held by the Honorable Supreme Court in the state of Bihar versus Kameshwar Singh, reported in 1952 1 ACR 889. And the limitations for the applications of doctrine of colorable legislations are: the doctrine has no application where the power of legislature are not fettered by any constitutional limitation. The doctrine is also not applicable to subordinate legislations. The doctrine is a colorable legislation does not involve any question of bona fides or mala fide on the part of legislature. The whole doctrine revolves itself in the question of competency of a particular legislature to enact a particular law. If the legislature is competent to pass a particular law, the motive which impelled to act becomes irrelevant. On the other hand, if the legislature lacks competency, the question of motive does not arise at all. Whether a statute is a constitutional or not is thus always a question of power. It was so held by the Honorable Supreme Court in AR 1953, Supreme Court, page number 375. This should be the limits of colorable legislations. And this 8 doctrines should mark the end of the introspection of constitutional doctrines.
I invite Mr. Om to render the vote of thanks for the evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Siva, for a very nice session. You have continued with your mandate of continuing with these doctrines. We could find that there are a lot of efforts which have gone into it in taking out the doctrines as well as trying to identify with the case laws on each of the subject. I hope that all members have been benefited. The extent of learning which you had is being passed on to the members of study circle today. Thank you very much for your efforts. We keep going by these kinds of sessions, more of an in-house nature, where we are benefited more than just talks which had happened on other days. Thank you very much. Thanks for all for having joined the day. Thank you once again, Shivashankar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.